The purpose of this video is not to give anyone legal advice. Since I am not a member of the bar, I do not offer anyone legal advice. This video has been made to promote and strive for the protection and realization of certain fundamental rights and freedoms. When you look at international covenant that's called Declaration on the Right and Responsibility of Individuals, Groups, and Organs of Society to promote and protect universally recognized human rights and fundamental freedoms. In Article 1, it says, everyone has the right, individually and in association with others, to promote and to strive for the protection and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms at the national and international levels. The purpose of this video is to speak about, bring forth, and explain how to give effect to our human rights and fundamental freedoms within domestic laws. In Article 6 of the DRR, it says everyone has the right, individually and in association with others, to know, seek, obtain, receive, and hold information about all human rights and fundamental freedoms, including having access to information as to how those rights and freedoms are given effect in domestic, legislative, judicial, or administrative systems, as provided for in human rights and other applicable international instruments, freely to publish, impart, or disseminate to others views, information, and knowledge on all human rights and fundamental freedoms. To study, discuss, form, and hold opinions on the observance, both in law and in practice, of all human rights and fundamental freedoms, and, through these and other appropriate means, to draw public attention to those matters. It is the responsibility of all of us as men and women to not partake in the promotion of the destruction of our fundamental rights and freedoms, whether through ignorance or on purpose. Article 10 of the DRR says no one shall participate by act or by failure to act, where required, in violating human rights and fundamental freedoms, and no one shall be subjected to punishment or adverse action of any kind for refusing to do so. Article 15 of this covenant says that the state has the responsibility to promote and felicitate the teaching of human rights and fundamental freedoms at all levels of education, and to ensure that all those responsible for training lawyers, law enforcement officers, the personnel of the armed forces, and public officials include appropriate elements of human rights teachings in their training program. This video will be talking about the fundamental right and freedom concerning taxation. We will be looking in depth into contributions and corporations. Now, corporations and contributions, or corporations and taxation, walk hand in hand. And by watching this video, you're going to understand why they walk hand in hand, and one cannot exist without the other. Let us look first into the principles of justice as it pertains to this particular right. What exactly is the rule of law when it comes to contributions? So we look into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and we find the following brought forth. All peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. All peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation based upon the principle of mutual benefit and international law. In no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. So we are taught that we are taxed, or we must pay a taxation, because we have to do our part for society. We are taught that we are taxed based upon the principle of mutual benefit. That's the reason why we are told we are forced to pay a taxation. Now here, in international law, it's bringing forth a right that says that no people can be forced to contribute to a society based upon the principle of mutual benefit. That's the right that's being brought forth in here. Now, when you look deeper into the International Covenant in Article 5, it says nothing in the present covenant may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms recognized herein, or at their limitation to a greater extent than is provided for in the present covenant. So we looked in Article 1 of the covenant, where it says that the people cannot be forced to contribute based upon the principle of mutual benefit. Now, in Article 5, it says these rights can be limited if the covenant allows them to. So let's look back into the covenant and see upon this right of contribution, can it be limited? Is there a limitation that the state party is allowed to place upon it? Well, when we look in Article 47 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or Article 25 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, we find the following statement. It says, nothing in the present covenant shall be interpreted as impairing the inherent right of all peoples to enjoy and utilize fully and freely their natural wealth and resources. So in Article 1, it states that all peoples may, for your own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources, and without any obligation arising based upon the principle of mutual benefit. Further to that, in the covenant, in Article 25 and 47, it says there's nothing in the covenant that can be interpreted as forcing the people to contribute, as taking away the right of the people to enjoy and utilize fully and freely their natural wealth and resources. So when they say you have to pay a taxation, you have to make a contribution to the society based upon the principle of mutual benefit, what they are doing is they are limiting your fundamental right and freedom. They are taking away your ability to fully and freely use your natural wealth and resources that you earn and pursue after. Now, the obligation fell upon the state party to provide an operation of law through their domestic laws to allow you to exercise this right. Because the covenant says in Article 2.2 of the covenant, we're not already provided for by existing legislative or other measures. Each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take the necessary steps in accordance with its constitutional process and with the provisions of the present covenant to adopt such laws or other measures as may be necessary to give effect to the rights recognized in the present covenant. So you just saw that there is a right that is recognized in the present covenant, and that right is that you can freely dispose of your wealth and resources without any obligation based upon the principle of mutual benefit, and that there is nothing in the covenant that can force you to make a contribution. There's nothing in the covenant that allows them to take away your right to fully and freely use your natural wealth and resources. And this right had to be transferred into domestic law through the constitutional process or through other laws or other measures. But this right had to be transferred, showing the principle of fundamental justice. So Article 1 says all people may, for their own needs, freely use their resources they earn and gain without any obligation to contribute to society based upon the principle of mutual benefit. Article 25 and 47 says nothing in the covenant can be interpreted to impair or remove the right of all people to enjoy and utilize freely and fully their resources. This brings forth the fundamental right enumerated in the covenants, the fact that the covenant grants a choice to the people concerning contributions, and that nothing in the covenant takes away that choice from the people. You continue on by bringing forth Article 2. It says the state party must respect and ensure your rights as recognized in the covenants. And Article 5, where nothing in the covenant can be interpreted as implying that Canada has a right to engage in any activity or take actions aimed at the destruction of my right and freedom to freely utilize my wealth and resources. This brings forth the principle of fundamental law when it comes to taxation. This shows and demonstrates to the court step by step the fundamental principles as they pertain to contributions. Remember, this is an obligation on your part. You must prove that by forcing you to contribute, The state party is against the principles of justice. The covenant grants the right to utilize freely your resources. The covenant states nothing in it can remove this fundamental right. The covenant says if this right does not exist in state party domestic law, the state party must ensure and give effect to the right. The state party cannot perform action to destroy the right. This is the principle of justice concerning taxation, contributions. This is the complete expression of our fundamental right, standing in our full legal capacity. There is nothing that can force us to contribute, for there is no provision within the covenant itself that permits such actions. This principle of justice concerning contributions is guaranteed and protected in Article 7 and Article 26 of the Constitution Act of 1982. The next step to defending against this violation of our full legal capacity is to find out what mechanism of law that is being used to limit and deny us the right and freedom. What operations of law domestically are being used against us to limit our rights contrary to the principles of justice. The state party created a statutory power, an enactment, designated the Income Tax Act, and it is this statutory power that Canada is using to deny you your full legal capacity before them. The executive powers are pointing to an internal power, an internal law, the Income Tax Act, and claiming that this statutory power produces an obligation upon you to pay a taxation. I believe, and I put forth, that the ITA is actually violating several of our fundamental rights and freedoms, several of our human rights and freedoms, several of our natural rights. Every year, individuals are forced to pay a taxation. When you look into the federal income tax enactment, you will find that income for the year is defined and designated in a particular way. There is a legal definition as to what income for the year means in the enactment. So the federal income tax enactment, Part 1, tax payable by persons resident in Canada. An income tax shall be paid, as required by this act, on the taxable income of each taxation year of every person resident in Canada at any time in the year. So everyone who is paying taxation and is paying federal income tax or provincial income tax, this is where the obligation is coming out. This is where the obligation against you is being brought forth. They created a domestic law, an enactment, a statutory power, and they called it Federal Income Tax Enactment. And they said in Part 1 that a tax is payable by every person who is resident in Canada. So here we are seeing that an income tax is paid on taxable income for a taxation year. The income tax is paid by every person resident in Canada. Now, when we look to the Supreme Court, we see Thompson versus Minister of National Revenue. We find the following on page 220. It says residents are taxed, not Canadian citizens, but residents within the meaning of the Act. So many people think, well, Canadian citizen is the one that is taxed. No, it's not. The judge has already declared that it's residents that are taxed and not Canadian citizens, but residents within the meaning of the Act. Now, you can be a permanent resident here in Canada. You do not have citizenship, but yet you are still paying taxation. You still have to pay a contribution. And here, that explains to us why the judge declared that. He knows, he understands the law, and he's saying it's residents that are taxed, not Canadian citizens, because there are permanent residents in Canada who are not Canadian citizens, and they are suffering taxation also. Now he goes on to further explain to us that it's residents, the word residents, within the meaning of the Act that are taxed, not just when you use the word general. So if you use the word in general conception or general terms, you would say, I'm a resident in Canada. Some people, again, would think that means that I'm living on the geographical area in Canada. They think the word resident means to be living in Canada. However, the judge didn't explain to us here what the word residents mean. in the income tax enactment, he just simply told us that it is a resident that is taxed, not a Canadian citizen, but resident within the meaning of the act. So you and me, we have to find out what the word resident means within the meaning of the Income Tax Act. Because the one who is taxed, according to the act, it says every person resident in Canada has to pay a taxation on taxable income. And then the judge told us and taught us that residents are taxed, but residents within the meaning of the act. So we're going to look into the income tax enactment and find out what the word resident means in the income tax enactment. Many think that the statement every person resident in Canada means everyone living in or on the territory of Canada, the geographical landmass. However, this is not the case. When we look into what the legal designation of Canada is in this article of law, we find the Supreme Court declaring that the Canada being spoken about here in the Income Tax Act is a corporation and not a territorial location. The right to create a system of taxation was originally brought forth in the Constitution Act of Canada, 1867, Article 91, subsection 3. The Constitution Act, 1867, Article 91, it shall be lawful for the Queen, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and House of Commons, to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Canada, through the raising of money by any mode or system of taxation. The Constitution Act, 1867, Article 91, lawful for the Queen to create a system of taxation. This will be applicable in Canada. Constitution Act, 1867, Article 91, the Canada that is being brought forth here is a corporate body. When you look to the Supreme Court of Canada, in the judgment concerning this, it says the word Canada in section 91.1 of the Constitution Act 1867, right here. The word Canada does not refer to Canada as a geographical unit, but refers to the juristic federal unit. A juristic person, see artificial person. A person, a juristic person, is an artificial person. An artificial person is a corporation. We already understand that. The word Canada here means a corporate body, a corporate or corporation. So when they allowed or they gave the right concerning the raising of money by any mode or system of taxation, it was within the corporate body of Canada. Because this right, this power, came out of the Constitution Act, Article 91.3. The Queen had the right to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Canada. The Supreme Court has told us that this Canada is a body corporate. It's a corporate body. It's a corporation. And they have the right within this corporation to create any mode or system of taxation. We are going to go really deep into that point later on in this video, but let's go on. The Canada that is being brought forth is the corporate body, and the laws concerning income tax are applicable within the corporate body. Keep that in mind. Part 1, again, of the Income Tax Enactment, an income tax shall be paid, as required by this Act, on taxable income for each taxation year of every person resident in Canada at any time in the year. So the Canada they're talking about is the corporate body, okay? And the resident, meaning doing business in that corporate body. So you have to be doing business in the corporate body of Canada in order to have taxable income, in order to be able to pay a tax to them. This is what it's saying. So somehow, some way, every single individual here in Canada has to be incorporated or has to be brought into the corporate body of Canada and be declared that they are doing business in this corporate body. And they did it. And I'm going to show you today exactly how they did it to each and every one of us. The Constitution Act of 1867, Article 91. It created a system of taxation to operate in Canada, and this Canada is a body corporate. Canada, the Income Tax Act, the Supreme Court has said, is a federal juristic unit. Canada, in the Constitution Act, is a federal juristic unit. Only a person who is part of the corporate body designated Canada must pay a tax. Since we are dealing with an enactment, a statutory power, we know that the person being brought forth here is a class of person. Where it says every person resident in Canada, they're talking about a class of person, a certain person. So for example, when you're in your car and you're going down the road, you're considered a driver. That's the class of person they consider you. When you go to school and you're having an education or taking an education, you're considered a student. That's the class of person you are. When you go to the hospital because you're sick and you use your hospital card, you're considered a patient. That's the class of person you are. In the income tax enactment, the government wants us to accept, to play the role, and enter into recognition as this class of person. To stand under the legal designation means that we are controlled by the enactment and that we owe duties to the enactment. We give up our full legal capacity to accept duties under the enactment. When you look at the court judgment here in Canada, Thomson Newspaper Limited versus Canada, while individuals, you and me, men and women, as a rule, have full legal capacity by operation of law, artificial persons, classes of persons, are creatures of the state and enjoy civil rights and powers only upon the approval of statutory authorities. So what that is saying is that when you play the role of a class of person, you are controlled by a statutory authority. You are controlled by the enactment that governs the class of person. So for example, if you're a driver and you're in your vehicle driving, you're a class of person, the driver. If you're speeding in the 50 zone and you're going 90 kilometers an hour, they pull you over and they give you a ticket. And they say you breached the enactment. Why? Because as a class of person, the driver, you have the obligation to obey the enactment, the statutory power. The only right and freedom you can exercise is the power or the duties or responsibilities that come out of the enactment. The enactment controls you when you're the class of person. But the courts have already said individuals, as the rule of law, have full legal capacity by operation of law alone. You have your natural rights, your fundamental rights and freedoms, your human rights and freedoms by operation of law alone. You do not need an enactment or a statutory power to grant you this right. Now, to force you to play a role of a class of person is a violation of your fundamental rights and freedoms. There is no justification for these actions. The simple fact that they force you into recognition as a class of person is a violation of Article 16 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Article 7 of the Constitution Act. International law says everyone, the human being, the man or the woman, has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. You have the right to enter into recognition as a class of person before the law. It's a right. A right does not produce an obligation. A right grants you the choice. As a citizen, as that class of person, the citizen of Canada, you have the right to vote. Come election time, the state party does not force you to use your right to vote. They do not send police officers to your door, knocking on the door with the guns drawn, and say, today is the day to vote. You have a right. You have the right to vote as a citizen. You must go and use it. No, a right does not produce an obligation. Until now, in law, a right allows you the choice. In international law, as a man or a woman, you have the right to recognition everywhere as a class of person before the law. Article 16 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights guarantees to all human beings, men and women, the basic human right to be recognized as a person before the pursuant to this provision. The individual is endowed with the capacity to be a person before the law, to be recognized as a potential bearer of legal rights and obligations. So you have the capacity to be recognized as a person before the law. You can be recognized as the class of person, the driver, And if you are, then you're the bearer of the legal rights and obligations of that class of person. If you're speeding, and the sign says do 50 and you're doing 90, you bear the legal rights and obligations of the driver. And if you're caught by the policeman, he will issue you a ticket because you broke your legal obligations. So you have the right to enter into recognition as a class of person before the law, and under the income tax enactment, they are forcing you into recognition as a certain class of person. And that class of person, in law, what they are declaring is that you are operating as an officer in an office of the corporate body of Canada. That's what they're declaring. So when you study the law and look into it, what your capacity is before them is they are saying you are an officer operating in an office of the corporate body of Canada, and therefore we have the right to force a taxation from you. And you will see how they are doing this through their statutory power, through their enactment. The question still remains, is how is the state party Canada, through their enactments, forcing me to pay a contribution by claiming I am part of the corporate body? This needs to be determined and expressed, as it shows the exact nature of the violation against our full legal capacity. When you are exercising the right to work, as described in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in Article 6, when you are out there earning, pursuing, and gaining after a living, instead of enjoying an adequate living, you are either doing this from the position of working for someone as an employee, or you are the owner of a company acting as an employer. Those are the only two positions. You're either working for someone or someone's working for you. This is the starting point of the operation of law that they are using to designate all of us as the class of person under the income tax enactment. As the owner of the corporation, you are considered to be an executive power, the director or president of the company. In the Articles of Incorporation, you declare that you are the director of the corporation. Depending how the company is set up, you could be voted into position such as president, vice president, or if there is no executive board and you simply run the company, you are doing so from the position of a director. Owner of a corporation, he's the employer. He's the executive power. He operates in the office of a director or a president. Employee, they are hired and appointed to positions, such as a cook, accountant. They get paid to do the work. All corporate bodies doing business for profit must incorporate under the same operation of law. It does not matter if the corporation will be a McDonald's, a dental clinic, a construction company, a disposal company, whatever it may be. All these corporate bodies are incorporated under a specific enactment. Now, depending on what province you live in, and if you do it provincially or if you do it federally, will depend on what the enactment is used. But it's the same operation of law. And I'm going to use a specific one for this video for Ontario. This is the government office that must be used in order to incorporate a body corporate. This office, although it is provincial in nature, is being operated by an executive power of Canada, an officer of the corporate body of Canada. So you see, in the Ontario Business Corporations Act, that's where you have to go to incorporate yourself. But this office that you go and see, even though it's provincial in nature, it's operated by an executive power of Canada. And we know the executive power of Canada is an officer of the body corporate of Canada. So Harvey's, Pizza Hut, Boston Pizza, Tim Hortons, construction companies, dental clinics, pet stores, they all must incorporate through this government office. And when you look into the enactment, it says minister means the Minister of Consumer and Business Services or such other member of the Executive Council to whom the administration of this act may be assigned. Just to make it clear again, in order for you to open up a corporation and then subsequently hire employees, you have to do so through the Articles of Incorporation. You have to go in Ontario to the Ontario Business Corporation office, fill out the form, and ask to be incorporated. Now, the one who's running this office, when you go and see them, here, it says it's a member of the Executive Council whom the administration of this act is assigned to. So the powers that you are dealing with, they've been assigned their position. The member of the Executive Council who will administrate the enactment is assigned or appointed into position. This is an important mechanism to take note of and to remember. The executive minister is assigned into his position into this office. So the head power that you're dealing with has been appointed to his position. He's been assigned into this office. Further to this, we find in the enactment itself that the minister can appoint a director who will carry out the duties and exercise power as a director under the Act. Ontario Business Corporations Act, Article 278. The minister may appoint. Notice those words, okay? Appoint and assign. The minister may appoint a director to carry out the duties and exercise the powers of the director under this Act. Both of these positions are positions that a person was appointed to. Further to this, we see that the person appointed, a director, is to operate in the position of a director for this office. The minister, the executive power, appointed and is assigned to administrate the enactment. The executive power is corporate in description. The minister, the executive power, appoints a person, the director, to operate the position of a director, the director of the corporate office. The minister, the executive power, officer of Canada, part of the body corporate. So the Ontario Business Corporations Act creates a government office, creates an office in the body corporate called Canada. The director, who is the one who is in charge with the responsibility of running this office, this section of the body corporate. The articles of incorporation that he must follow and abide by are contained within the Ontario Business Corporation Act. This enactment is what governs and controls his duties, just like your articles of incorporation would control your corporation. Well, this enactment controls this office of Canada. So you go to open up your corporation, you go to the Ontario Business Corporations office. It's part of the government office. It's part of the body corporate called Canada. Therefore, it's a subsidiary of Canada. The director is appointed into position, and he is responsible for running this office. We see in the Ontario Business Corporations enactment that the minister, the executive power of Canada, appoints a person, appoints a director of this corporate office into position in this enactment. Now, when we look into the income tax enactment, in the definition of what an office means, we find the following. An office means the position of an individual, entitling the individual to a fixed or ascertainable stipend or remuneration, and includes a judicial office, the office of a minister of the Crown, the office of a member of the Senate of the House of Commons of Canada, a member of a legislative assembly or a member of a legislative or executive council, and any other office, the incumbent of which is elected by popular vote, or is elected or appointed in a representative capacity, and also includes the position of a corporation director. An officer means a person holding such an office. So if you work in or as a judicial office, a minister of the Crown, a member of the Senate, a member of the House of Commons, a member of the legislative or executive powers, a member or person in the position of executive council or any other office, if you work for any office which the position is voted for, or if you are a director of a corporation, or if you are a person appointed in a representative capacity, then you are considered to be an office in an office of Canada and are an officer of Canada. So under the income tax enactment, it says that if you're a director of a corporation, or if you're a person appointed in a representative capacity, then you are considered to be operating in an office of Canada and are an officer of Canada. We are seeing under the ITA enactment that a director of a corporation is considered to be an office of Canada. We also see that any position that is appointed to is also considered to be an office in Canada. We further see that the persons operating in those positions are then designated officers. A director of a corporation, a person appointed into the position, are all offices of Canada, and the individual operating in the office is an officer of Canada, officer of the corporation designated Canada. So they're saying that there are offices, and the ones who work in the offices are officers of Canada. Now let us go back into the statutory power, Ontario Business Corporations Act, where everyone opens up their corporations and where subsequently everyone hires employees to give them work. When we look into the Ontario Business Corporations enactment, we see that the executive power is assigned or appointed, and there is also a director who is appointed. This is explaining to us that these positions are offices of Canada and officers of the body corporate called Canada. So remember, under the Ontario Business Corporations Act, we see in Article 278, the minister may appoint a director to carry out the duties and exercise the powers of the director under this act. So the office is director, and the individual appointed is director. Now, because he's appointed, what does it tell us? That it's an office and an officer of Canada. Because back under the income tax enactment, when we look at the definition of what an office of Canada is and what an officer of Canada is, it says any person appointed or any director of a corporation is automatically considered to be an office and an officer of Canada. So when you incorporate your corporation, you are doing it through this enactment. And the officers of Canada are the ones giving you the right to operate as an office in Canada. An individual fills out the prescribed form and then pays the fees necessary to be able to carry on business through the corporation. They just created through the Articles of Incorporation. The director of the office, called the Business Corporations Branch, will grant you, confer upon you the right and privilege to operate your office in Canada if you follow their rules and regulations. Financial Administration Act, Article 19.1. The Governor and Council may, on the recommendation of the Treasury Board, by regulation, prescribe the fees or charges to be paid for a right or privilege conferred by or on behalf of Her Majesty in right of Canada, we know what Canada we're talking about here, by means of a license or permit or other authorization by the persons or classes of persons on whom the right or privilege is conferred. This is the article of law in the Financial Administration Act, is the operation of law, the mechanism that is used in order for the director of the Ontario Business Corporations Office to charge you for the right to do business in Canada. You incorporate a corporation, you pay a charge and a fee for the right. The right will be conferred upon you. You can open up an office in Canada and do business. you can incorporation into the body corporate of Canada. So when you open up your office or when you open up your corporation, you are actually incorporating yourself into the body corporate of Canada. And the enactment that you're using to open up your corporation is actually doing this to you, and no one is telling you that this is transpiring. See, when an individual opens up a company, what is actually transpiring in law is that the individual is being granted a right to incorporate in Canada and operate an office as an officer within Canada. The director of the Business Corporations Act is appointed into his position and is thereby operating as an officer of Canada. The director is the one who will issue you the certificate of incorporation and allow you to operate as a corporation, subject to his authority over you. So when you look into the Ontario Business Corporations Act, Certificate of Incorporation, an incorporator shall send to the director articles of incorporation, and upon receipt of the articles, the director shall endorse thereon, and in accordance with Section 273, a certificate which shall constitute a certificate of incorporation. So you send out your form. Usually you have a lawyer do it for you. Not a good move. You send out your form, and you send it out, and the director is the one who endorses your right, once you pay your fee, to become incorporated. And what's transpiring? Further to this, for the purpose of this act, the Ontario Business Corporations Act, a body corporate, the one you just opened, shall be deemed to be a subsidiary of another body corporate if, but only if, it is controlled by that other body corporate. So, a body corporate, your corporation, will be considered a subsidiary of another body corporate if it is controlled by that body corporate. Well, when we look into the Ontario Business Corporations Act, we see what's transpiring. In Article 167, it says the director may make inquiries of any person relating to compliance with this act. The director who granted you the right to incorporate your corporation keeps control or executive powers or primary power over your corporation. If you're a restaurant, they will send inspectors to your restaurant and make sure you are complying. If you are, for example, a construction company, they will send inspectors to your work site to make sure you are complying. The Governor General in Council keeps authority over your corporation, and as such, you become a subsidiary of this body corporate. So we know the director who grants you the right to become a corporation, he's appointed into position. In the enactment itself, it teaches us that the director is appointed into position. And because he's appointed, therefore, under the income tax enactment, what is he? Appointed, director of a corporation. He's an officer operating an office of Canada. So he's part of the body corporate of Canada, operating an office out of the body corporate of Canada. You come along, you ask to be incorporated, he grants you the right, he lets you be incorporated, but as a subsidiary of his corporation, of the Corporation of Canada. And he keeps ruling control or authority over you. Every year, you must report your income to him. You must report your income tax, what your corporation made, what it paid, and so forth. So what they're transpiring in law is they are making you a subsidiary of the Office of Canada. The statutory instrument is declaring that if a body corporate is under the control of another body corporate, it is taken or deemed to be a subsidiary. The Ontario Business Corporations Act creates a body corporate under law. It is an office of the body corporate of Canada. In the enactment, there is a director who controls the obligations and duties to the enactment. The director is the one who allows you to incorporate your business, and he is the one who regulates you and controls you under the enactment. Since he is regulating and controlling you, your corporation is deemed to be a subsidiary of Canada, And that is how and why you are considered to be operating in the Corporation of Canada. Director is part of the body corporate of Canada. The director controls your corporation under the enactment. You're deemed to be a subsidiary of Canada, the body corporate. As the owner, the incorporator of the corporation, you are considered to be an executive power, the director of the company. In the Articles of Incorporation, you declare that you are the director of the corporation. Depending how the company is set up, you could be voted into position, such as president, vice president, which would create a board of directors, or if there is no executive board and you simply run the company, you are doing so from the position of a director. The position and the duty is created and brought forth through the enactment itself. So when you look into the Ontario Business Corporations enactment, it says in Article 115, subject to any unanimous shareholder agreement, the directors shall manage or supervise the management of the business and affairs of a corporation. Now, board of directors. A corporation shall have a board of directors. So you see, here's the contrary intention in law. What's transpiring? They're saying that a corporation shall have a board of directors. Now, if you have a board of directors, if an individual is forced into playing the office of a director of a corporation, then under the income tax enactment, he falls under the office and officer of Canada. Because in the income tax enactment, we saw an office and officer of Canada means a director of a corporation. Now here, the statutory power, when you go to open up your business to earn, gain, and pursue after a living, it forces you into the position of a board of directors or to be appointed as a corporation director. Therefore, you're further to the office and officer of Canada. Now, in the case of a corporation that is not an offering corporation, at least one individual must be the corporation director. In the case of a corporation that is an offering corporation, not fewer than 3 individuals. So, the statutory power forces you into a class of person, forces you to play the officer operating in an office of Canada. Ontario Business Corporations Act. Definition of director. Now, the director of your corporation. Director means a person, okay, so an individual is a director. Director means a person, now occupying the position of director of a corporation. So you have the office of the corporation, which is director, and you have the individual, the officer, the person, playing director. And by whatever name called, and directors and board of directors include a single director. So even if you have a board of directors, it says that it's considered a single director, meaning that it's a director within law. Now, corporations shall have a board of directors. A corporation is a public corporation, 3 or more individuals as a board of directors. If a corporation is private, then a single director. This statutory power just limited and abridged your full legal capacity by forcing you to enter into recognition as a class of person designated the director. This enactment creates the legal obligation upon you to enter into a class of person designated director. In the Ontario Business Corporations Act, director, again, means a person. So the individual, the officer. You're an officer, you're a director as the officer, and you're occupying the position or the office of a director. So director means a person occupying the office. Then when you look into the income tax enactment, officer means a person holding such an office. So 1 plus 1. When you look into the Ontario Business Corporations Act, director is a person in a corporation, is a position, in a corporation. The term director designates the office in the corporation. In the income tax enactment, the definition, office, means the position of the individual. So the office is the director, and the person is being forced to play the position of director. And you see it clearly. Director is the officer. That's the class of person. Director, position, is the office in the corporation. Now, again, I condensed the income tax definition in order to bring it out clearly. So an office means the position of an individual, the incumbent of which is appointed in a representative capacity, and also includes the position of a corporation director. An officer means a person holding such an office. So you just opened up a corporation, and guess what happened to you? You became the director of the corporation, and therefore you are operating as an officer in an office of Canada. But we know you are anyways, because subsequently to that, they made you a subsidiary of their office when they allowed you to incorporate. But it just comes out clearly in the income tax enactment. We are seeing under the income tax enactment that a director of a corporation is considered to be an office of Canada. We also see that any position that is appointed to is also considered an office in Canada. We further see that the persons operating in those positions are then designated officers of Canada. If you own a corporation, then you are the director of it. Or if you are part of the executive powers voted into position of authority, then you are a director. And in both capacities, you are operating an office in Canada as an officer of Canada. This enactment, this statutory power, is also limiting and abridging charter rights by creating an article of law that forces those who come looking for work into a class of persons, into operating as an officer in an office of Canada. So to own a corporation designates you a class of person, director, and you become an office and an officer of Canada. Now, how do they designate or force employees of the corporations to become officers of Canada operating in an office in Canada? So you opened up a corporation in order to earn, pursue, and gain after a living. You're ready to go, and now you need employees. So under the enactment, look how they designate and term employees. Now, subject to this article, the bylaws, or any unanimous shareholder agreement, the directors may designate the offices of the corporation, appoint officers, specify their duties, and delegate to them powers to manage the business and affairs of the corporation. So Article 133 is a blatant violation of our full legal capacity. So the directors of a corporation will designate the offices of the corporation. So for example, if you're a construction corporation, then you have offices of this construction corporation, such as framers, drivers, and sales. If you're a Harvey's restaurant, you have offices in this restaurant, such as general managers, cooks, cashiers, and janitors. Now, the directors of the corporation will appoint officers. That's what it says here. The directors may designate the offices of the corporation, offices, framers, drivers, sales, cooks, cashiers, and appoint. So notice the words they're using here. Offices of the corporation and appoint officers. Well, if we fall back under the income tax enactment, anyone that's appointed, remember, we dealt with the first part of it as a corporate director, but what's the latter part of that in the income tax enactment? It says a person appointed in a representative capacity is considered to be an officer operating in an office of Canada. Well, when you're hired by a director or an owner of a corporation, you are hired to represent that corporation, whatever capacity it may be. So the directors of the corporation will appoint officers. Construction Corporation, Mark and George, the director hires you and appoints you as the framers. That's the office. Jason, Joey, and Mike, the director hires you and appoints you as driver to pick up the building materials. Kathy, Mary, and Christine, the director hires you and appoints you into sales. Again, with Harvey's, Jason and Leo, the director hires you and appoints you as general managers, one for night shift and one for day shift. Kat and Mike, the director hires you and appoints you as cooks. Jennifer, Helen, and Tanya, the director hires you and appoints you as cashiers. So the point being here is that every position that is being taken in these corporations, they're being appointed to. You come in, you bring a CV, the guy questions you, he likes your experience, he hires you. He doesn't hire you as a cashier and then the day you come to work, make you be the janitor. He hires you and he appoints you to be the cashier. He hires you and appoints you into the specific position of the corporation. And by the fact that he hires you and appoints you to represent his corporation, you fall under an office and an officer of Canada. The directors of the corporation will delegate to them powers to manage the business and affairs of the corporation. So the Construction Corporation, Mark and George, are given permission to use tools and so forth. They are given the duties to go out and construct the framing upon new building contracts. They are given certain vehicles to transport themselves to the work site and are expected to work 40 hours a week, among other duties. Jason, Joey, and Mike, they are given duties and responsibilities concerning their office, concerning what they were hired for. They will have to drive a truck and loader and transport materials to and from work sites all day. They are expected to start at a certain time and finish their day at a certain time. Kathy, Mary, and Christine are expected to push the sales of new buildings through telephone service, and individuals who show up at the office looking for help concerning building a building. They must show up for work at a certain hour and be dressed accordingly and perform the duties assigned to them. So this is exactly what's transpiring when you look. The director may designate the offices of the corporation, appoint the people or persons operating in their offices, and specify their duties and delegate to them the powers to operate the corporation. All these positions in the corporations, framers, drivers, sales, general managers, cooks, cashiers, janitors, whatever it may be, are appointed positions according to the statutory power that they enact. In Article 133, it says directors may designate the offices of the corporation and appoint officers, specify their duties, and delegate to them powers to manage the business and affairs of the corporation. This is the mechanism of law, the operation of law that is used to try and force everyone to pay a tax, a contribution. These statutory instruments are bringing forth the legal ground through limiting and denying us our fundamental rights and freedoms, our full legal capacity, that we are all operating in offices as officers of Canada. The director, who is an officer operating in an office, the one who owns the corporation, he designates offices in the corporation. Then he appoints officers to the office. That's what the statutory power is declaring. And he delegates powers to the officers. So the director, who is an officer operating in an office, is resident in Canada, part of the body corporate Canada. When we look into the income tax enactment definition, office means the position of an individual, the incumbent of which is appointed in a representative capacity, and also includes the position of a corporation director, and officer means a person holding such an office. So the director of a corporation and any person appointed in a representative capacity is operating as an officer in an office of Canada. And they do this to us through the Business Corporations Enactment. When the individual, if you are an employee, when the corporation or individual that you are working for, when he went and incorporated his corporation and opened it up, this is the position he was put into. The enactment forced him to be a director and play a role of an officer and Office of Canada. And when you were hired under this section 133, and you were appointed as an officer, and you were given duties and powers to manage the business of the corporation within your office. And that's how they did it to all of us, if you're the employer or if you're the employee. If you are a director of the corporation or are appointed into a position, then you are operating an office and are an officer under both the Income Tax Enactment and the Ontario Business Corporations Act. As the owner of the corporation, you are forced to play the role of a class of person designated director. The statutory instrument itself, the Business Corporations Act, is limiting your full legal capacity by forcing you into residence within Canada. All the employees that you hire and appoint to position in your company are being designated an officer occupying an office in Canada. They also are standing as a class of person, a statutory creature, without full legal capacity. In the Income Tax Act, the only person that must pay a tax is the person resident in Canada. We understand that this means the person who operates an office as an officer of Canada must pay a tax. Remember, it said an income tax shall be paid, as required by this Act, on taxable income for each taxation year of every person resident in Canada at any time in the year. And how do they all make us or try to force us to be that class of person resident in Canada? It starts with the incorporation of businesses. You go to incorporate a business, then you are considered a subsidiary of the Office of Canada, the corporate body of Canada, and you are forced to play the position, the class of person of director, and you are appointing officers into offices within your corporation. Therefore, you fall under the Income Tax Enactment. When you look in the Income Tax Enactment, the designation of employee is brought forth and described as follows. Employee includes an officer. Now, when you understand what the word includes means, it's closing off the designation. Whatever is about to be mentioned is the only thing that is going to define the word employee. An employee includes an officer. Well, how, if you're working as a cook in McDonald's, how are you an officer of Canada? What is the operation of law that they use to make you an officer of Canada and force you to pay a taxation? If you're a cashier at the local grocery store, how are you an officer of Canada? What is the mechanism of law? What is the operation of law they used against you to force you into that class of person, the officer? Well, again, when you went and applied for your job, the one who hired you was considered the director of the corporation, and he created the offices of the corporation, the cashier or the cook, and you got appointed to that position as an officer, and you were given your duties and your powers to operate in that office. And that's the mechanism of law that they're using. All employees are considered officers under the Income Tax Enactment. We just saw step by step how this is transpiring, what operations of law are being used to bring forth this legal ground. The Business Corporations Act creates an Office of Canada, part of the Corporation of Canada. All companies that are opened under this office are subsidiaries of this office. All employees are officers of the Corporation of Canada. It does not matter what corporation an individual works for as an employee. They are appointed into that position. They are operating as an officer, and the position they are occupying is an Office of Canada. The owner of the company who incorporated the company was forced into giving up their full legal capacity, as was any employee who came to work for the company. The one who owns the company is not at fault for what is transpiring. They did not understand that they have been designated a class of person through the designation director, and that they are operating in an office in Canada. The directors of these companies, the owners of these companies, they must apply a withholding against the salaries they pay to their employees. They are told that they are obligated under the statutory instruments to apply a withholding against what they pay to their employees. They are not to blame. They are being forced through ignorance and intimidation to do so. The Income Tax Enactment protects all directors, owners of companies, from what they are doing. In Article 227 of the Income Tax Enactment, It says no action lies against any person for deducting or withholding any sum of money in compliance or intended compliance with this act. So the director hires you, he appoints you into position, and then when he pays your salary, the government tells him you have to withhold against them. You have to withhold taxation when you pay their salary. And if you want to go against the director of the company who hired you, the income tax enactment protects him. Why? Well, first of all, it's not his fault. The enactment is forcing him to make a withholding against you, and sure enough, he probably doesn't even understand what's transpiring in law, how he was rendered an office and an officer of Canada, how he is personally being taxed, how his corporation is being taxed, and now why he has to tax you. As a subsidiary, your corporation is an office in Canada. As a director of the office and the officers in the offices, you are required to apply a withholding. The enactment protects the director from being sued. So the owner of a corporation is forced through the Income Tax Act to withhold money against salaries paid to the employees. The man or woman who is forced to do this is operating from the class of person designated the director. The director of the corporation who appoints the offices and officers into the corporation is responsible to withhold against them. So here, in the Income Tax Enactment, Article 153, every person paying at any time in a taxation year salary, wages, or other remuneration. So what person are they talking about? Which person is paying? Well, we know who it is. It's the director, the one who hires you and appoints you. So here, every director paying at any time in a taxation year salary or wages now shall deduct or withhold from the payment the amount determined in accordance with the prescribed rules and shall, at the prescribed time, remit that amount to the Receiver General on account of the pay's tax for the year. So when you get your salary, your biweekly or weekly salary, you see they take off money, old age pension, unemployment insurance, CCP, whatever it may be. So here, this is the operation of law they're using. When the director pays you your salary or wage, he shall deduct or withhold from the payment the amount prescribed, the amount determined beforehand. Now, further to this, it says, where at the prescribed time, where they're going to pay you, the person is a prescribed person, the remittance shall be made to the account of the Receiver General at a designated financial institution. So did you notice that? You have to be a prescribed person. The one who is being deducted from or withheld against is a prescribed person, where at the prescribed time, the person is a prescribed person. Well, who do they have the right to take off an income tax against? What designation in law? Do they have the right? Are they doing it to a man or a woman, or are they doing it to a class of persons? What is the prescribed person in this article of law? Whatever employee, whatever position you are operating from, what are you? You're an officer of Canada, operating in an office of Canada. The only one they have the right to withhold against is the officer of Canada, operating in an office of Canada. Every director paying at any time in a taxation year salary, wages, shall deduct or withhold from the payment the amount determined, where at the prescribed time the person is a prescribed person, the remittance shall be made to the account of the Receiver General at a designated financial institution. Director of the corporation, paying salary to its officers, will deduct or withhold an amount against a prescribed person. The prescribed person, the class of person, is the officer of Canada. This prescribed person being brought forth here, who will have the money deducted, is the officer of Canada, operating in an office of Canada. The state party gets us to play this role of person by using the two enactments combined in order to declare the legal ground that we are officers in an office and that we are resident in Canada. And remember, the income tax enactment, an income tax shall be paid as required by this act on taxable income for each taxation year of every person resident in Canada at any time in the year. The director of Harvey's or the construction company are a subsidiary of the Corporation of Canada. Any corporation that is opened is a subsidiary of the Corporation of Canada. It is resident in Canada. Officers, the persons, are resident in Canada. When you look in the income tax enactment, and definition of the word employed means performing the duties of an office or employment. So we know if you're performing the duties of an office, what are you? You're an officer, and you've been appointed into the office, and you've been given powers to perform those duties. So you're employed as an officer. And what does employment mean? Well, employment means the position of the individual in the service of some other person. And servant or employee means the person holding such a position. The legal ground that is being brought forth here is connected, closed operation of law. Being employed has two meanings: performing the duties of an office or employment. But these terms, duties of an office and employment, mean the same thing. Employed means performing the duties of an office. I receive the duties of the office by the director of the corporation. I am in service to the director through my duties. I am then also an officer of the corporation by default. Employment means the position of the individual in service to someone else. I am in service to the director, and as such, I am an officer of the corporation. My position is an officer of the corporation. And then again, when you look, employee includes an officer. So they're just trying to confuse you a little bit in what they're stating here, because we understand that to be employed means that you're performing the duties of the office or employment. And employment means that you're in service to some other person. And we know through the Ontario Business Corporations Act, we are in service to the director. Why? Because we are hired as officers, appointed into office, and given duties by the director. Employed, employment, the position of the individual, cook, driver, sales, in service to the director. Employed, duties of an office of Canada, again, in service to the director. When I have employment as an individual, I am appointed into an office, and am an officer of the corporation. The director appointed me, and I am in service to the director. Throughout this explanation, there has been numerous violations against our full legal capacity, our fundamental rights and freedoms. It is these limitations placed on us that is the mechanism that we need to use to free ourselves from statutory control. The first violation starts with the fact that we are forced to use our right to work. This was a right that we had, not an obligation. And by forcing us to work, that alone is a breach of our full legal capacity. The second violation that is transpiring against us is through our interactions with the state party, we are having our charter rights under Section 7 and 27 or 26 limited and abridged, contrary to the principles of fundamental justice. As the individual who wanted to open up a company, I approached the director of the Business Corporations Act with and under my full legal capacity, my charter rights and freedoms. I was asked to complete a prescribed form and sign it. Through the form and the enactment itself, my full legal capacity was limited and abridged. I was instantly rendered a class of person, titled a director, and was being placed into an office of the corporate body Canada and forced to accept to be an officer of Canada. Subsequent to that, any individual who applies to work at my corporation is considered to be appointed to the position and becomes a class of person operating as an officer in an office of Canada. What is transpiring through these enactments is contrary to our fundamental rights and freedoms, our natural rights. The executive, legislative bodies are forcing us into recognition as a class of person, incorporating us into the corporation without our consent or knowledge. In the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, I believe that Article 8.2 and Article 16 protects us from this tyranny, from these operations of law of being forced into recognition as an officer of Canada. We are being forced to play a role and enter into recognition as a class of person, the officer, before the law, which is contrary to our natural rights and freedoms. The executive, legislative body have an obligation not to limit or abridge our rights and freedoms. The third violation that is transpiring against our charter rights and freedoms is that we are being forced to contribute to the social, economic, and cultural development of Canada. We are being forced to pay a tax against the wealth and resources that we are pursuing after for our living. The provisions of the Income Tax Act and the provisions of the Ontario Business Corporations Act are limiting and removing our full legal capacity. Now, as I stated before, the operations of law that I shared with you today, found in the Ontario Business Corporations Act, it operates in every subsequent provincial enactment. Whatever province you live in, if you incorporated yourself under the Provincial Corporations Act, it's the same operations of law that are being used against you. And these operations of law are limiting and removing our full legal capacity. Because remember, in international law, it says we have the right to freely use and dispose of our wealth and resources without any obligation based upon the principle of mutual benefit. And there was nothing in the covenant that allowed them to force us to make a contribution. However, instead of bringing forth this right and protecting this right, what they did is they created enactments, they created statutory powers which forced us into a class of person, into recognition as a class of person through the Business Corporations Enactment and through the Income Tax Enactment. A man is being forced to use the right to work. Through this right, he goes and applies for the right to open up a corporation in order to earn a living, to provide food and shelter for his family. What is transpiring against him and his full legal capacity is not explained to him. The director of the Business Corporations Act is operating an office in the corporate body Canada. The man incorporates his company by declaring the articles of incorporation and sending in the prescribed form to the director of the Business Corporations Act. The man is granted the right to open up his business after he pays the charges and fees which allows him to exercise this right. The corporation that the man opened is now a subsidiary of the body corporate, the Corporation of Canada. The man is now operating as a director of the subsidiary of Canada, the Office of Canada. As a director of the subsidiary, the office, he is considered an officer of Canada, operating an office in Canada. He is doing business in Canada and is resident in Canada. The man now appoints individuals into the positions of his corporation. These positions are considered to be offices of the corporation, and the one appointed to their positions are officers of the corporation. Everyone involved now are resident in Canada through this operation of law. Everyone now designated as operating as an officer in Canada, operating an office in the Corporation of Canada. The human being, exercising the right to work, incorporates a company. He pays fees and is granted the right to be a subsidiary of Canada. The man is now a class of person, a director of the subsidiary. The director appoints individuals to the offices, and everyone is an officer operating an office in Canada. You and all the employees that you employ are being designated officers of Canada. The provisions in the enactment, the Business Corporations Act, is a mechanism, the operation of law, that is used to create this legal ground and place you upon it. The legislators and the executive powers are limiting and abridging your fundamental rights through the provision of this enactment. In Slate Communications Incorporated versus Davidson, we find the following. It follows that any body exercising statutory authority, for example, the Governor in General or Lieutenant Governor in Council, ministers, officials, municipalities, school boards, universities, administrative tribunals, and police officers are also bound by the Charter. Neither body can authorize action which would be in breach of the Charter. Thus, the limitations on statutory authority, which are imposed by the Charter, will flow down the chain of statutory authority and apply to regulations, bylaws, orders, decisions, and all other action, whether legislative, administrative, or judicial, which depends for its validity on statutory authority. The statutory power that is being used against you violates your full legal capacity as a human being. It is limiting your natural rights and freedoms, being forced to play a class of person incorporated into the Corporation Canada, and then subsequently being forced to pay a tax to contribute to the social, economic, and cultural development of Canada is against your fundamental rights and freedoms.